Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss any update from Rouse IAS Study Circle. Join the only official Telegram channel of Rouse IAS Study Circle to get the relevant materials and important updates. Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why and how of the newspaper analysis from the Civil Service Examinations perspective. So today we are going to discuss the Hindu Daily edition dated 22nd June 2022. The topics which are to be discussed have been displayed on your screen and the timestamping of the same has been provided in the description box below. Before starting today's discussion, we have an important announcement for you. For the upcoming Mains 2022, we are starting the optional test series and QIP program. The optional test series at the Delhi campus are for 8 subjects, which is shown in your screen, and the optional test series for the Bangalore campus are for 4 subjects, which is again in front of your screen. For all the further queries, you are requested to contact the number given on your screen. Our first topic is in relation to the recent floods which has occurred in the state of Assam and has claimed several lives and has led to destruction of a huge amount of property as well. As we all know that monsoon has arrived in India, and that is why the phenomena like floods are going to be in news on regular basis. And in this very sense, we need to be aware about the concepts of floods, the factors which cause the floods as well as its management issues. As far as the UPSC scheme of syllabus is concerned, this topic falls under the Mains General Studies Paper 3 in the section of Disaster and Disaster Management. Moreover, if you go by the previous year question paper analysis, the question has already been asked in the context of floods, but the dimension was restricted to the urban floods. The question read that frequency of the urban floods due to high intensity rainfall is increasing over the years. Discussing the reasons for the urban floods highlight the mechanism for preparedness to reduce the risk during such events. In this prelim, today we will discuss the basic concept of the floods. What are the factors which make Assam state highly vulnerable to floods every year? Those are the combination of natural factors as well as the man-made factors. In the last, we will discuss the management and prevention strategies. This we will cover in 2 broader components. First is the steps which must be taken during the floods and the long-term steps as well. So now let us begin our discussion. First of all, we should understand that what basically is flood. Because if we are able to understand the floods, then obviously we will be able to understand the factors that how are certain factors more responsible for increasing the intensity and frequency of floods. So this is a rough diagram of a floodplain. Suppose this is a river channel and this is the borders of the river channel characterized by the formation of natural levees. Now what are these natural levees? Natural levees are the sandbars which you find generally across the margins of the river channels, whereby due to continuous deposition of sediments, a long narrow ridge is formed. These ridges are known as the natural levees. They mark the border of the river channel. Now we assume that river is flowing within this river channel. This is the width of this particular river channel. Now if the river discharge or the volume of a particular river exceeds the channel capacity of this very river channel and it spills outwards, then we will say that the situation of flood has occurred. That means the river discharge has increased the river channel capacity, which has led to the overflow and the spilling of the water, in turn leading to the floods. Now, if you have to think about the reasons or factors responsible for this flood, you just have to focus on those factors which either increase the river discharge, that is, which either increase the volume of the water in river, or those factors which reduces the river channel capacity. For example, in layman language, suppose we have very high precipitation. Now high precipitation will automatically increase the river discharge and can lead to floods. So on the other hand, suppose we are encroaching these floodplains and now the floodplains have been reduced to this width. That is, we have reduced the capacity of the river channel. Even in that scenario, we will face floods because now the capacity to hold that particular amount of water is reduced. So basically you have to focus on those factors which increase the river discharge on one hand or will decrease the river channel capacity on the other hand. So these factors are basically divided into two important parts, that is the natural factors as well as the man-made factors. If you are aware about all these factors, you just have to analyze that what are those factors among these factors which can be superimposed on the state of Assam. That is, these are the general factors. But what are those unique conditions in the state of Assam which favor these general factors? So we will analyze this one by one in detail. So the first factor, as we have discussed, is the high rainfall or the precipitation rates. Now we know that the state of Assam in its northern side is bordered by the Himalayan range. And this particular region we know are the deltaic region of Bangladesh. And here we have Indian Ocean, that is the Bay of Bengal region. Now we know that during the summer season, the southwest monsoonal winds move towards the northeast direction and they pick up the moisture from the Bay of Bengal region. Now when these moisture laden winds strike the Himalayas, the wind rises in upward direction, and because of the condensation, we have a type of rainfall which is known as orographic rainfall. Orographic rainfall is that rainfall which is caused due to the presence of mountainous range, and those mountains has resulted into upliftment of the wind. Now because of the presence of these Himalayas along the borders of Assam, this particular state every year experiences very high rainfall. Second is the high deposition rate. Now let us understand that if this particular river channel is experiencing high deposition rates, that means that it is carrying a lot of sediments, then obviously the water holding capacity will be reduced. Let us understand this. Suppose this was the river channel and earlier the water was filled from base to the topmost part. Now because of the continuous sedimentation and deposition of the sediments on the base of these rivers, let us assume this. Now the depth of this river channel has considerably reduced because this much depth has been consumed by these sediments. So this reduction of depth further in turn leads to the decreasing river channel capacity. Now let us see that how this happens in Assam. Now we all know that these Himalayas are the sedimentary rocks, and sedimentary rocks are weaker rocks, and that is why they are more prone to erosion. Now because of the continuous erosion of the sediments of these Himalayas which are brought down by the rivers, for example Brahmaputra in the state of Assam, leads to the higher deposition on the floodplains in the region of Assam. Similarly, the third is the long courses of rivers. Because again, if we are having long courses of rivers, that means the erosive capacity of those rivers will be very high. Because all across their long routes, they are continuously eroding all the rocks which is present in their entire course. And we know that we have one of the biggest and longest rivers, that is Brahmaputra, which enters into the state of Assam. This Brahmaputra brings a lot of sediments due to erosion of the Himalayan rocks, and as soon as it enters the state of Assam, it experiences a break. And because of this break, there is a drastic reduction in the gradient of the land surface in the state of Assam compared to the Arunachal Pradesh. So all the sediments which was being carried by the Brahmaputra on the steeper slopes till Arunachal, it suddenly get deposited in the state of Assam because of the reduction of the slope. Then we have the changes in the river course. For example, earlier the river was flowing in this direction, and because of the continuous deposition and frequent meandering, suppose the river now changes its course. That is, now it begins to take more sinus curves. So all these regions which earlier were far away from the original course now come under the impact of these rivers. So this is what exactly is done by the changes in the river course, and that is why in the Assam, because there is a frequent meandering of Brahmaputra as well as its little tributaries, the flood proneness increases. Next factor is the landslides. Now landslides again, because with the landslides the rock particles, the debris, sediments, sand, silt, clay, gravels, all the sediments which are brought down by the landslides are eventually deposited on this river channel bed, which in turn we have understood that reduces the river channel capacity. This is what exactly happens because of the steeper slopes of Himalayas and the weaker nature of rocks. It is highly prone to landslides. Further, this region is also tectonically active, that is, frequent earthquakes further increase the intensity and frequency of the landslides in these particular regions. And whatever sediments come down, they are deposited in the floodplains of Assam, which in turn increases the floods. Now, these are the natural factors in the Assam which lead to increased floods every year during the monsoonal season. Now, let us understand what are the man-made factors. Man-made factors are also in general, and that is true for the state of Assam as well. The first is the wetland destructions. Now, we all are aware about the important wetlands in the state of Assam. That is, we all know the formation of beels or the oxbow lakes. But with the increased pressure, increased demographic load, these wetlands have been encroached. Similarly, the encroachment of the floodplains is also an important factor. This encroachment reduces again the river channel capacity. The wetlands many a times have a very strong and diverse vegetation which stops the fast flowing water of the floods and prevents the areas lying nearby. Similarly, the floodplains offer vast areas to store the excessive water during the flood situations. But now, because they have been destructed or been encroached, the areas which earlier were storing the excess waters are not available now. The third important aspect is the increased upstream construction. That is because of the rise in tourism activities, mining, industrialization, and urbanization. The construction activities in the upstream areas, that is, in the hill areas, are increasing the superincumbent load on those areas, which in turn increases the frequency of the landslides. Next factor is the dam mismanagement. Now we all know that dams were constructed with primarily twofold objectives. One was the irrigation and the power generation, and the second was the flood control. Obviously, if we are able to efficiently manage the dams, we will be able to control the floods. But the problem is that dam mismanagement increases the flood. For example, let us assume that a dam has a reservoir on its upstream side, and before the onset of monsoon, it has to discharge its excessive waters downstream so as to store the water which will be there in the monsoon season. But suppose this water has not been discharged timely, and now the monsoon arrives with high amount of precipitation. This precipitation will further increase the levels of the reservoirs present upstream, and then a very large amount of water has to be discharged on immediate basis in the downstream areas, and hence making these downstream areas highly vulnerable to the immediate release of water, in turn leading to floods. On the other hand, all across the year, this upstream area has been continuously submerged under the reservoir. That means in the upstream areas, dams have led to submergence, that is the flooding situation of the entire area. The last important factor is the deforestation which is carried by the humans. Now the forest, we all know that they bind the roots and they prevent or reduces the speed of the flowing water, hence they control the floods. Second, with the availability of the forests or natural vegetation for that matter, they hold the soil together and thus it reduces the soil erosion. If we have reduced soil erosion, that means that the deposition will be on the lower side. But now if we have cut down our forest, that means we have increased the soil erosion, and all the eroded sediments of these soils will be deposited in these particular river channels, thereby reducing the channel capacity. And the third important aspect is that with the deforestation, there is a continuous release of the greenhouse gases as well. Now, these greenhouse gases lead to increase in the temperature, And this increase in temperature further lead to melting of the glaciers, and this melting of glaciers increase the discharge of rivers. And as we discussed in the beginning, that if the river discharge increases, we have high probability of floods. So these are the natural as well as man-made factors behind the recurrent floods in the state of Assam. Now we will discuss the management and prevention strategies. Now, management and prevention of the floods has two important components. First are those steps which are to be taken during the floods, that is, when we are facing the disasters, what we have to do. And second are the long term steps so that we are able to prevent the frequent occurring of the floods in Assam in the long run. So, let us understand this one by one. If we are already facing the flood situation, the first important task is the restoration of the communications. Because many a times it happens during the times of natural disasters like floods, the communication lines are shut down or they are broken. And that is why the people and administration are not able to contact with each other efficiently. And hence, to establish that communication, restoration of those lines are very essential. Second is deployment of the National Disaster Response Forces as well as SDRS in order to have efficient evacuations from those areas. The people from the low-lying areas must be transported to the higher areas in order to reduce the possibility of deaths due to floods. Then is the relief measures. Relief measures can include several steps. For example, tenting of the displaced population, food supplies, water supplies, and in this association, the fourth important point is also the medical aid. Many a times we tend to forget this important step in our answer. Now, this medical aid is not just in the terms of medicines. This medical aid must also be accompanied with the psychological support. You try to generate empathy for those people who have lost their family, their property, their documents, everything during the floods, and they are now relocated to certain higher areas. What mental trauma they are being going through, we have to empathize with it. No matter how much food, water, or tenting facilities you provide them, until and unless you are not able to provide the psychological support to that displaced population, to that person who has lost everything during the disaster, these measures will not be able to bring the fruitful results. In this very line, the role of civil society organizations are very important. Obviously, the central government, state government, along with the district administration, should take the lead in managing these disasters. But because of the sheer presence of the civil society organizations in the far flung areas, they must also be integrated in order to reap the maximum benefits. Now, these were the measures which should be taken during the floods, and now we will come towards the long term measures. The first is the microzonation of the floods in India. We must prepare a map. In fact, we have that map, but that map should be updated regularly because there is a continuous change in topography, landforms, human induced factors in several areas, and that is why the factors behind the floods, the vulnerable areas of those floods, they continuously change. That is why regular upgradation of the microzonation of the flood maps must be done. Second is the land use management. Now, as far as possible, we must try to have sustainable forest management practices. We must strengthen our wetlands. We must protect our floodplains. And the agricultural activities which are to be taken must be in line with the climate of that particular area. The crops must be roped which suits the geoclimatic conditions of those areas. Next comes the proper management of the dams. Next is the modern town planning principles, for example, the sponge cities. Now, what is the concept of sponge cities? Now, suppose this is a city having numerous buildings and concrete areas spread across. Now, sponge cities are those cities which are designed to harvest the natural waters. How can that be done? It can be done by having the pervious flooring conditions so that the waters which are available in those areas, for example, these sponge cities must have adequate blue and green spaces. There must be some pond, there can be some rivers nearby. So all the water, whether it is already available water or the waters which comes through the frequent precipitation, all that water must pass through this pervious florins and the groundwater must be recharged of these cities. That is why they are known as sponge cities. Just like the sponges which absorb the water, these cities must also be able to absorb that water, which in turn can supply the residents of these cities with the drinking water or sanitation water or etc. So the modern town planning activities like sponge cities must also be encouraged. Next, we must also focus on river interlinking projects so as to supply the excess water from the surplus basins to the deficit basins. And in the last, we must also go with the desilting measures of the river channels. The channels which are excessively prone to high deposition, for example in Assam. Desilting activities must be done in order to increase regularly the capacity of the existing river channels. So this was a bit lengthy topic and hence we will revise this topic in brief once again. So as we have discussed that this topic has appeared on page number 12 and is in relation to the recent Assam floods. In the beginning we discussed what is the basic concept of floods, that whenever the river discharge increases or the volume of water increases vis-a-vis the river channel capacity, the water is bound to have spillovers which in turn leads to floods. In this very line, we discuss that how the natural factors as well as the man-made factors operate in general as well as in state of Assam in order to induce floods. The natural factors composed of high rainfall, high deposition, long courses of rivers, changes in river courses, landslides. And the man-made factors were the wetland destruction, increased upstream construction, floodplains encroachment, dam mismanagement as well as deforestation. In the last, we discussed about the various management and prevention strategies which can be having two components. First is those activities which must be done during the disasters, during the floods, and those things which are to be taken as a long-term measures. This article has appeared at page number 6 in today's The Hindu Daily edition and is in context to the recent possibilities which point out towards increasing the retirement age of the Supreme Court judges. This whole article is thus in relation to the reforms which can be done in this particular context. As far as the UPSC scheme of syllabus is concerned, this topic falls under General Studies Paper 2 sections and in the micro section of the structure, organization and functioning of the judiciary. Now I have divided this topic in two important components. The first component which we will study are those views which are expressed in this particular article. After going through the views of this particular article, we will look at the overall topic of the judicial reforms. What are the issues in our judiciary which plague it in terms of high pendency of cases, in terms of higher backlogs, in terms of lack of infrastructure, etc. And then what reforms can be taken in this regard. So for that part, we will discuss it with the help of our previous DNS dated 9th May 2022. So let us begin our discussion today. There are three important views which are expressed in this particular article. First is that the author of this very article says that there must be parity in the retirement age of Supreme Court and High Court judges. Now, as we all know that the Constitution has provided the retirement age of Supreme Court judge to be 65 years and High Court judge to be 62 years. This author says that the retirement age of the Supreme Court and High Court judge must be equal. There are two prime objectives of this. According to this author, first is that it will bring the equality among the judges of the higher judiciary, and the second is that it will also reduce the competition among the judges in higher court. Because presently what happens is, because the retirement age of the high court judge is 62 years, there is a very high competition among the judges of high court so as to get the seat as the judge of Supreme Court in order to get 3 years of extra service. And this competition is not healthy for the judiciary according to this author. So in order to reduce this particular negative competition among judges, there should not be any luring reward for any judge to fight for the seat in Supreme Court, and that can only be done by having the equality or parity in the retirement age of both the judges. The second important reform according to this author is that the government must create a cadre of public services for the retired judges. Because we have witnessed it many a time that judges, after getting retired from the judiciary, like High Court or Supreme Court, they are appointed at certain constitutional posts, or they are made members to the political parties, or they are made members to the Rajya Sabha. Now, this brings the question of conflict of interest and also cast a shadow on the credibility of those judges. And a very few minority of the retiring judges take up for the public services. So that is why this author believes that there should be a dedicated cadre for these public services for the retired judges, and all the appointments to any constitutional posts thereafter should be made from this particular cadre. In this very line, author is also of the opinion that there should be post-retirement ban on the arbitration activities of the judges. Next comes an important part, the appointment of Chief Justice of India. This author says that according to the Article 124 of the Indian Constitution, the power to appoint the Chief Justice of India has been given to the President. The Constitution does not differentiate between the Chief Justice of India and the other judges of the Supreme Court in this manner. It just says that President shall appoint the judges of the Supreme Court. But presently we know that the Chief Justice of India is the senior most judge of the Supreme Court. Now this has not been mentioned by the Indian Constitution. This provision was laid down by the second judge case, where we also find the roots of the collegiate system. And that is why this author says that this particular provision, which was laid down in the second judge case, that a senior most judge of the Supreme Court shall act as the Chief Justice of India, goes against the wisdom of Constitution, because Constitution didn't lay that. And that is why this needs to be undone. And in the opinion of author, he says that the provision should be that the reputed Chief Justice of High Court shall be made as the Chief Justice of Supreme Court, because there are several instances whereby Chief Justices of High Court have proved their mettle and credibility to be equally valid to be appointed as the Chief Justice of Supreme Court. So these are the three primary views suggested as reforms in the context of the judges of higher judiciary. But from the UPSC's civil service examinations, we need to be aware about the overall issue of the judiciaries, their recommendations and everything. And that is why now we will look at this topic holistically. And we will learn about the basics of judiciary, that why judiciary is significant, what are its important functions. In this very line, we will discuss the issues which plague Indian judiciary and the suggested recommendations to resolve these issues. So now let us begin our detailed discussion. So first of all, the primary task of judiciary is to protect the rule of law and to ensure the supremacy of law. It is said that any society functions smoothly if it abides by the law which it has made. So in older times, those laws were customs, traditions or rituals. And in the modern times, those laws take their roots from the constitution or a written set of laws. For example, in India, we have a book constitution, we have IPC, we have CRPC, then we have several commercial laws, labor laws. So all these laws are necessary to ensure a smoother functioning of society. But then we need some institution to uphold and protect those laws. And in modern societies, that is judiciary. And if the judiciary is able to protect the rule of law and ensure the supremacy of law, only then we can say that judiciary is able to safeguard the individual rights. For example, in India's Constitution, Article 32 says that whenever there is a breach of fundamental right, the citizen can directly approach to the Supreme Court in order to protect his or her fundamental rights. So in this very basic sense, judiciary is important to protect the rule of law, ensure supremacy of law, and safeguard the individual rights. If it is able to complete these three pillars, we can say that judiciary becomes one of the most important pillars in order to protect and thrive our democracy. We also know that judiciary is one of the most important pillar in order to strengthen our federal government. So now as we can see that there is a huge responsibility to judiciary, and the power given to the judiciary is also immense because it has to deliver justice in the society. That is why it needs to be given adequate power. And as we all know that power corrupts the human mind, it is also true with the institutions also. And that is why if on one hand we give power to certain institution, on the other hand there must be accountability also. And in this very sense, India's judiciary is accountable to the India's constitution, to India's democratic spirit, as well as Indian people. We all know that our preamble starts with a term, we the people of India. That means the supreme power lies in the hands of Indian people, and that is why every institution in a democracy like India should be accountable to its people. But then, when we come across several news articles whereby we witness that there is a presence of corruption in India's judiciary, there are high pending cases, justice is not delivered on time, we think that what are those issues which are hindering the effective functioning of India's judiciary? And in this line, now we will discuss what are the various issues which plague Indian judiciary. So first and the foremost issue is the lack of regular appointments. There are several reports which claim that the seats of judges are lying vacant in subordinate judiciary as well as higher courts. The reports claim that around 20 to 40% of the seats remain vacant in high court as well as subordinate courts like district courts and session courts. And from here we can imagine that if we are functioning with such a low number of judges, how will they be able to deliver the justice on time? If we are not having adequate number of judges in our courts, there will be no one sitting on the chair to deliver the justice. And this has become one of the biggest reason in higher pendency of cases, which is our second issue. That is the higher pendency of cases. It is estimated that alone in the district courts in India, 2.5 crore cases are pending. Now, this is a very large number considering a country like ours. The case clearance ratio in India is very poor, and the disposal time, on the other hand, is very large. For example, the Niti Aayog report claims that around 20 years on average is taken in order to settle the disputes related to the land or property. Now, the lack of appointments is not the only reason for the higher pendency of cases. There is third major issue which plague our Indian judiciary. That is the lagging infrastructure and court management system. Now, if you go by these graphs, it shows the lagging infrastructure capabilities of our Indian courts. The basic infrastructure is also lagging. For example, this particular graph shows the sanitation facilities for litigants in 3028 court complexes which was surveyed by this particular organization. And it says that only 73% of the court complexes had separate ladies' toilet, and only 83% of the court complexes were having gents' toilet. That means there is around 16% of the court complexes which do not have toilets at all. Toilets for differently abled are present only in 29% of the court complexes. Similarly, if we go by the technological infrastructure of Indian courts, 30% of the court complexes do not have digital display boards, and only 14% of the court complexes have video linkage with medical officers. Similarly, just 30% of the court complexes have mediation conference room, and around 40% of the court complexes do not have record room. So the idea of these graphs is to show you that how our Indian courts are lagging in infrastructure and court management system. The fourth major issue is of corruption. According to Asian Human Rights Commission report, it is estimated that in India, for every rupees 2 spent in the court fees, there is rupees 1000 spent as bribery. Now, why do people are forced to bribe the court officials? The most important reason is to speed up the cases. Now, again, this issue goes back to the higher pendency of cases, which in turn is related to the lack of appointments, lack of infrastructure, and court management system. So, you can here understand that how all these issues are interrelated to each other. And the last but not the least major issue is lack of funding. Again, this is related to all these issues because if we are not having adequate funds, we cannot invest in infrastructure. If we cannot invest in infrastructure, we cannot resolve the pending cases in a time bound manner. Now, the lack of funding is not only related to the inadequate funding, it is also related to the underutilization of funds. The first issue is that adequate funds are not provided to the Indian judiciary. The second issue is that out of the total fund which is allocated to the judiciary, there is a huge underutilization. And the third point is that states share. The states are not providing the funds. For example, we know that in centrally sponsored schemes, the financial ratio between the center and the state is 60 is to 40. Now, even if the central government provides their share of finances, the states are not encouraged enough to provide their own share. And that is how we get inadequate funds. So, these are the major issues which plague Indian judiciary. And now let us move towards some possible solutions or suggestions which can better the conditions of our judiciary. The first recommendation is to create an all India judicial services as is also mentioned in our Indian Constitution under Article 312 Clause 3. This article was added by 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act. An important point related to the All India Judicial Services is that there will be an All India examination, and this examination will be regular and will be used to appoint the judges not lower than district judge. So by this we will be able to streamline the appointment procedure and the issues like lack of transparency, favoritism as well as nepotism will be resolved because there will be a transparent all India level examination. The second suggestion is creation of National Judicial Infrastructure Authority. Now, this authority will be the umbrella organization in order to strengthen and build the infrastructure of our courts. It is recommended that the Chief Justice of India will be the patron in chief of this particular body. The Supreme Court judge will be the executive chairman. There will be 4 Chief Justice of the High Courts in this particular body. And then there will be government officers also, for example, the secretaries. Now, this is done in order to ensure collaboration and coordination between the members of judiciary as well as the members of executive. If these both organs of the state come together and form the National Judicial Infrastructure Authority, it is believed that it will be responsible for strengthening the infrastructure of India's courts ecosystem. The third important thing is the creation of Indian court and tribunal services. Now, presently, what happens is that judges in the courts are tasked with 2 important functions. One is to deliver the justice, that is to interpret the law, and the other function is the administrative function. The judges are also responsible for the administrative functions in the courts, and this double burden the judges. And in order to resolve this particular issue, it is said that a separate Indian court and tribunal services should be formed. Now, there are several countries, for example, Canada, US, UK, whereby separate court and tribunal services, that is, separate administrative services, are established. Now, the main functions of the Indian court and tribunal services will be first to see the administrative functions, and second to identify the inefficiencies and suggest the reforms thereafter. The fourth major solution is to leverage the technology. Now we are into the age of revolution of IT, and that is why it is recommended that IT based technologies must be used in order to upgrade our judicial ecosystem. For example, it is said that artificial intelligence assisted judgment writing tools can be used. E-filing of the cases will reduce the hardships of common citizens. The case tracking will ensure accountability, and integration of the police, prison and court will be a major reform in the overall criminal justice system of our country. And the fifth major recommendation in this line is creation of special courts for issues like commercial disputes and more lok adalats in order to resolve the petty crimes and reduce the burden on our main courts. So that is how these solutions are recommended in order to streamline the effective functioning of Indian judiciary. Now let us revise this topic in brief once again. Under this topic, first we looked at the background of judiciary, that what are the important tasks of judiciary, that is to protect the rule of law, ensure supremacy of law and protect the individual rights in order to protect the overall democratic spirit. Next, we learnt about the issues which are plaguing the Indian judiciary in terms of lack of regular appointments, high ratio of pendency cases, lacking infrastructure and court management system, higher rates of corruption, and lack of funding. And in this very line, then we saw the recommendations which can be very useful in order to streamline the court functioning. The first suggestion is creation of All India Judicial Services. The second solution was creating the National Judicial Infrastructure Authority with Chief Justice of India as its patron in chief. The third was creating Indian courts and tribunal services to look after the administrative functions. This will be a specialized services. And the fourth was leveraging technology in order to fasten and enhance the efficiency of our courts. And the last was creating the special courts and more number of lok adalats in order to resolve the special cases like commercial disputes or the petty crimes in order to reduce the burden on our judiciary. This article has appeared at page number 7 and is in relation to the civil aviation industry. This article talks about that there is a need to revamp our airport infrastructure and to adopt a hub model. Now, what is this hub model? This basically refers to the integrated departure and arrival platforms. Because presently at airports, we have different locations for the departures and different locations for the arrivals. So the hub model is that at a single point, the flights will come, that means the arrival, and the flights will take off, that means the departure. As far as the UPSC scheme of syllabus is concerned, this topic falls under General Studies Mains Paper 3 section in the Economic Development portion and the micro section which clearly mentions as the infrastructure airports. In this very line, we should be aware about India's domestic civil aviation industry, their issues, recommendations, and the government steps. As far as the data is concerned, India has the third largest domestic civil aviation industry. Despite this fact, there are several challenges which this industry faces. So now let us look at the important challenges of this industry. First and the foremost challenge is the government intervention, because we all know that the flying rights over another countries totally depend upon the political relationship between those countries. For example, if Indian flights has to fly over the skies of Sri Lanka, let's say, then the relationship between India and Sri Lanka will govern these flying rights, which means that this is not dependent upon the companies or the commercial interests. The second issue is the rising fuel prices, given the fact out of the total operational expenses, 45% is shared by the fuel prices. And given the fact that recently the volatile geopolitical situations has increased the fuel prices, including the aviation turbine fuels. So this is one of the biggest challenge of this industry. Third issue is of congestion. Airports in India like Delhi, Mumbai as well as Bangalore, these airports are saturated with the availability of space and the number of flights which they receive. Further, because of the unavailability of the land nearby these airports on account of increasing urbanization and industrialization, we are not able to expand our airports. So now because the per capita income is rising and people are more preferably traveling through the air, that means that the number of flights are going to increase in recent future. However, we are facing with the space crunch to accommodate those flights. The next challenge is of the high airport charges in terms of parking fees, landing operations. All these charges take a toll on aviation companies and reduce the profitability of those companies. The last issue is related to the capacity of the human resources available. There is a huge shortage in the availability of industry recognized skills from pilots and crew to the maintenance and ground handling personnel. So these all are the multidimensional challenges which aviation industry in India face. But these challenges need to be overcome and there should be a way ahead to tackle these challenges. So the first suggestion is to enhance the aviation infrastructure. As we know that airports like Delhi, Mumbai and Bangalore are getting saturated and we are not having enough space around these airports. So only thing we can do is that we can develop alternate airports wherever the land is available. And hence we should complete all the planned airports which were visualized under the UDAN initiative, that is Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik initiative, in a time bound manner. We must revive the 50 unserved and the underserved airports or airstrips. These airports will reduce the excessive burden on the Delhi Mumbai like airports. The second suggestion is to increase the investment in the sector through financial and infrastructure support. For example, the taxes on the MRO services, that is maintenance, repair and operations, be reduced. Second is that these services must be granted infrastructure status in order to attract the private investment in these areas as well. Further, the parking infrastructure of the airports must be increased at all the metro airports. The third suggestion is in relation to the aviation turbine fuel and it should be brought under the regime of the goods and services tax. In order to address the shortage of skilled manpower, the courses led by the National Aviation University must be expedited and the government must focus on facilitating greater involvement of the private sector in sponsoring the aviation institutions. And in the last, in order to further liberalize this aviation industry, we must focus on more deregulation. On the other hand, we must also strengthen the regulatory capacity with respect to the public-private partnerships. In these lines, we should also be aware about the recent policy support or the steps taken by the Indian government in this regard. The first is government came up with the National Civil Aviation Policy in 2016 which aims to affordable and accessible flying services to the people. It covers all the 22 areas of civil aviation sector. The next scheme we have already mentioned it, Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagarik. Its short form is UDAN scheme, whereby smaller cities and remote regions were visualized to be connected to the mainline aviation industry. And regional connectivity scheme was an important component of this particular scheme. Further, Nav Nirman scheme deals with the infrastructural expanse of the airport capacity, which aims to increase the capacity by at least 5 times in order to handle increasing number of trips in a year. So in this session we have discussed the existing challenges of the aviation industry, how we can address these challenges and what has government done in this particular regard. This topic has appeared at page number 7 and is in relation to the global standards for artificial intelligence ethics. So that is why this article talks about the ethical concerns with the latest technology of artificial intelligence lead to. And in this very regard, this article talks about the important recommendations which has been made by UNESCO in order to reduce the vulnerability, that is the ethical vulnerability of artificial intelligence associated technologies. In this very regard, in today's session, we are going to discuss with various issues related to the artificial intelligence, and we will also discuss the important recommendations made by UNESCO in order to reduce those issues. So now let us begin our discussion. Now, as we all know that we are living into the era of technology, and virtually everything which we use today is somewhat related to the modern technologies. In recent days, the focus has been shifted towards new and emerging technologies like big data, robotics, machine learning, as well as Internet of Things, etc. And despite the fact that we know that there are several benefits, that is economic benefits, social benefits, etc., of all these technologies, yet there are certain concerns as well. And out of all those concerns, the ethical concerns are of paramount importance. So let us understand that how these new technologies like artificial intelligence are leading to those ethical concerns. The first issue is that several experts believe that artificial intelligence is going to rise the existing inequality across the world. This inequality might be the case of developed versus developing countries, it might be rich versus poor, or it might be company versus the state. Let us understand this. Now, all these technologies are highly capital intensive in nature, and that is why most of the times the ownership of these technologies are with the rich people. Now, this rich can be an individual person, or this can be a developed country, or this can be a multi billionaire company. So what will happen is that if the ownership are restricted in the hands of developed countries, rich individuals or the companies, the ones who will suffer will be the developing or the LDCs, the poor people or the state. Now this dimension is very important because there are certain companies whose annual incomes or profits are way larger than the GDP of certain states in Africa. From this, we can understand that the impact which this company can make over those smaller states while negotiating certain corporate deals, which in the long run will be detrimental for the overall socio-economic as well as ecological status of that particular country. Next issue is the environmental issue. Now, these technologies are energy intensive. It is believed that the technologies which are used in artificial intelligence consume around 10% of the total global energy which is used in the technological sector. This is a very high consumption and hence that can be detrimental on the ecology and environment. Third issue is related to the gender. Data suggests that just 22% of the total workforce employed in this particular sector is represented by women. So, this gender skewed nature of the workforce in this sector reflects the gender biases also. More importantly, have you ever wondered that why are the personal assistant devices always have female tones? For example, Siri, Alexa. So all the personal assistant devices have predominantly female voice. So in a way, this artificial intelligence technology is concretizing the existing gender stereotypes in our society. Further, we all know that with coming of these modern technologies, which can do a work of hundreds of individuals in few seconds, there are high chances that the unemployment rate will drastically increase. And the last issue is obviously related to the privacy concerns. Today, when we use Google, YouTube, etc., there is a mad race going on across the world to collect the consumer's data. And we, while using all these applications, unknowingly or knowingly, are giving our data to these multinational companies. And then we do not have any control on our own data once we have given that data away. So there are high privacy concerns associated with the artificial intelligence technology also. In this very regard, there are important recommendations given by UNESCO. The first important recommendation is in relation to protecting the data. The UNESCO's recommendations 2021 says that individuals must be the owners of their own data and they shall be given accessibility to either preserve or even erase the records of their personal data. They must be given the right to erase their records also. Further, it recommends to increase the ability of the regulatory bodies around the world to enforce this particular right. The second recommendation is in the regard that UNESCO says that the member states should consider that ultimate responsibility and accountability must always lie with the humans. That means that the technology must not replace the humans and these artificial intelligence technologies should not be given legal personality themselves. For example, tomorrow if you ask certain information under your Right to Information Act, then the government cannot say that this was done by some robot and that is why we are not accountable for that. No, legal personality must not be given to these technologies and the ultimate accountability must lie with the humans. The third important recommendation is in regard to monitor and evaluate the performance. For this, the UNESCO says that ethical impact assessment has to be developed which will compare the countries and their steps which are taken in order to analyze all the ethical impacts of artificial intelligence technologies. Further, the member states should also consider adding the role of an independent artificial intelligence ethics officer. So this person will be overall authority dealing with such scenarios. The terminologies can be different in different countries. However, the basic idea is that for this specific issue, there must be some dedicated authority to regulate it. And last recommendation is in regard to protecting the environment. The recommendations incentivizes the government to invest in green technologies and to use artificial intelligence technologies in only those scenarios whereby we have concrete data that this technology does not have disproportionate negative impact on the environment. So these are the major UNESCO's recommendations for having ethical use of artificial intelligence technologies in the modern world. And you can utilize these recommendations in your answers, ethics paper as well as essay paper. Now is the time for the question of the day. The question from yesterday's DNS dated 21 June 2022 was in relation to the Dutch disease. The question said, the Dutch disease in the field of economics is associated with which among the followings? The correct answer to this particular question is option C, which is the adverse impact on the economy due to large-scale appreciation in the domestic currency. The question of the day from today's DNS dated 22nd June 2022 is in front of you. The question asks you which of the following reasons are responsible for high floods in the state of Assam. 1. High rainfall. 2. Sedimentary nature of Himalayas. 3. Abrupt break in the slope. The options are A. 1 and 2 only, B. 2 and 3 only, C. 1 and 3 only, or D. 1, 2 and 3. So that's all for today. All the very best. Study hard.